Again, there are terrible descriptions. A ball might enter your mouth through the cheek or the jaw, and it doesn't because it's soft lead flattening out at such a high caliber, 0.58 or 0.577, that it cannot pass through the way a modern bullet would. So it rattles round your mouth, taking out your teeth, and then it does what I call travel. It will continue traveling, but it can't push out, so it may go up and come out your eyeball or behind your ear. And there are terrible wounds where a mini would, say, come in the shoulder and then travel the body length. And officers would actually say to the men, don't crouch over when you're charging, because if it comes in, it will go throughout your whole body. It was actually, my students used to say, well, why did they march standing up? Well, the answer is that it was better to try to have it come through rather than bend and have it just destroy all your organs.
Now, the officers led
They did.
in battle.
They did.
What percentage of the officers got wounded and killed on both sides?
It's huge, and I apologize for a historian. I have a foul memory.
But it's huge.
It is huge.
Well, I'll take that.
I would have to go to the book, but it is huge, and particularly for generals. Generals, as you say, did lead from the front. It's not only their ethic, but it's the physical necessity. As you know, the black powder weapons produced a thick white smoke. A general had to be forward to see what was happening, or an officer. And so the casualty rate was extremely high. The one I always think of, and it's the obvious famous one, is Pickett's brigadiers in the charge at Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge, and all three of his brigadiers going down, two dying, one badly wounded. And Armistead, I think, showing that enormous courage towards the end, putting his hat on his sword to lead them in, almost certainly knowing he'd written his death sentence.
This was both because of military necessity to lead and to be there to see what's happening so you can change when necessary, whatever, but also the Victorian sensibilities.
It is. You're absolutely right. It is the ethic of manliness, of heroic behavior, and I question whether at some point it blends into foolhardiness.
You talk about Custer.
Yes, exactly.
About
that almost irresponsible flamboyance where the ethic of the attack overwhelms him. And I think on the other side, a good example might be John Bell Hood, who, taking over from the cautious Johnson, who does not want to see his men slaughtered, leads in a very hell for leather way, as you said, Custer did. But I have to say, I find their capacity for heroic suffering quite remarkable. The famous example, I think, is Gordon on the Confederate side in the sunken lane at Sharpsburg, where he takes 4 or 5 rounds before he finally falls down and his blood streaming from his arm, and he's finally hit in the head, and that knocks him down, and he's bleeding so badly that if his hat hadn't been holed, he would have drowned in it, quite literally. So, yeah.
Well, the closest I've come to war was not very close. It was right under my feet, though, at the National Portrait Gallery. I was there for the Manuscript Society's annual convention, and we were inside the halls there. It used to be the first patent office in Washington, and it's a beautiful building, and the crown jewel. If you've never seen it, you've got to go. And we were sitting there sipping champagne and eating steaks, and
Nice.
it started to dawn on me, below my feet is what Walt Whitman was talking about. And he was giving succor to huge numbers of young men who needed him as a companion, as a mother. And he was there right under my feet. It almost took me off my
Yes.
Steak it did, not the champagne, but still, nonetheless, it almost did.
Wise
To know
choice.
what the horrors were underneath. Now, Whitman wrote that the cruel war will not get into the books, as you mentioned, until now.
Right.
Your book.
Thank you.
Just give us, very briefly, this general statistics of death and wounded on the sides, each side.
It is huge, and again, I have to apologize. I don't carry statistics well, but we are looking at in today's terms, at in their terms, well over 600,000 dead, and in addition to that, a massive number of wounded. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to suggest that when we talk about the wounded, it does not stop there. You know, when we hear about Afghanistan or Iraq, we hear, 4 killed by a roadside bomb and 10 wounded. We tend to dismiss that. But it's missing limbs, terrible physical wounds to the face. And one of the things I do in the book that I think we talked about off camera a little earlier is to try to give what these people are going through immediacy. And what I do, I take the case notes of a pioneer neurological surgeon, Weir Mitchell, and we accompany him as though we're running, because he was a very animated man, running down his neurasthenia ward with him, and he talks to us about the cases we're seeing. A soldier shot in the right shoulder, but it's paralyzed his left side, and months after that wound, he still cannot move his left arm off his chest. He has to be opiated to stand the pain, and of course then this leads to drug addiction. And many of these soldiers, the wounds have produced a marble-like state, so that the leg or the limb, the shoulder, you can knock on, and it's blue, black, inflamed, and to actually find relief they have to constantly drip water. But many of them never heal. You know, you mentioned Whitman, and one of his that just struck me forcefully was that he saw a young man in the hospital who had been shot through the bladder, and the wound had abscessed, and months later he was still lying in a pool of his own liquid waste. They could not stop it, and his bed was soaked with this foul stuff.
Yet, this was all in the future when the war began.
Yes, it was.
And society was sending off its youth
Yes.
to this war, which they thought would be over quickly. I'll give them that.
Yeah.
But I remember there was a poster that came out during the Vietnam War that said, "Girls say yes to boys who say no." Then I read in your book, I was really struck by it. If a fellow wants to go with a girl now, you quote
Yes.
someone saying, he had better enlist.
Yes,
Well, that's a big difference.
it is.
So, of course, this is before the inevitable fall of the patriotic
Right.
fervor and excitement of war. But what made them go into war and continue on in war when they saw this in front of them? You know, there's a Forbes. This one, I may as well just show this right now, real fast, because here is a Forbes painting from 1876, is copyrighted, and it's called "A Halt in the Line of Battle." And we're seeing just that, the soldiers lined up there, and in front of them still, they have no time to start cleaning the battlefield, and there are dead sitting in front of them,
Yes.
and they're ready to go back in. I mean, if I saw that in front of me,
Right.
I'd say, well, you know, maybe poker in the back would be better.
Yes, I think it did finally get to them. You know, that picture shows them standing calmly in line. Of course, they didn't have a choice really, because behind them were the non-commissioned officers and the officers ready to run them through or shoot them if they ran, and behind them cavalry. But many of them did stay. They didn't know what else to do. You know, the community behind them exerted great pressure. if you ran, if you deserted, you were posted at home, and you could never go home again in an era where that meant quite a bit. But many of them did break. They deserted. In the end, hundreds of thousands deserted, or they broke down.
Hid during the battle,
They
or broke down, as you say.
ran, or they became emotionally broken down. And even at home, I found towards the end, communities that had strongly supported the boys going would finally say, if a boy knocked his front teeth out so he couldn't bite the cartridge, or shot his trigger finger off, okay. So there was a change, and one thing I didn't do, that as we talk I regret not doing, is to try to find in the diaries and letters of civilians regret for forcing the boys forward. Now, when I worked on World War One for my book, The Great Adventure, about World War One in Europe, I was disturbed that the civilians didn't change enough. That war went on for 4 years, as the Civil War went on here for 4. And civilians continued, by and large, to support doing this. And it's very hard for me. The literary critic and historian and World War II vet Paul Fussell says in his book, The Great War in Modern Memory, how could they have continued to shove their sons into this cauldron? And he also cannot fully answer the question, why is it that we finally continue to let this happen? Perhaps one reason I didn't find that many instances of guilt feelings is that perhaps they weren't there, truthfully.
Well, I was going to ask some questions on civilians and the soldiers' relationship. What was their interplay, and how did it evolve? And was there a difference in the North and the South in that interplay as the war went on? Certainly, this is not the first war where at the end soldiers have come home and been treated poorly.
Right. The interplay, I think, is very complex. You do have support for the troops. At the same time, particularly in the North, you have an ambivalence. The North is not invaded. You don't have people perhaps pulling together in the face of the invader quite as much. When soldiers are home on leave and they've picked up bad habits, they're drinking their ears off, as I imagine many Chicagoans are doing at this very moment on St. Patrick's Day.
It's a possibility.
It's a possibility. The civilians don't like it. And soldiers continue in the North, as they had with the old army, to have a somewhat unsavory reputation. Whereas I think more in the Confederacy, particularly when the war is lost and the lost cause is romanticized, the boys come to have a mythic presence. It's not true during the war so much, though. The South is the battlefield by and large, and both sides preyed on civilians. One of the things that really surprised me was how many, not guerrillas or partisan rangers, but regularly enlisted Confederate soldiers actually stole from their own population, raped their own population, particularly black women. And so it is a complex relationship.